Listen. Just listen. There is a river in Serbia, a gorge so deep that the walls block the sun for part of every day and the water at the bottom moves like it has somewhere important to be. This is the Iron Gates, the place where the Danube cuts through the last mountain before the flat plains of Central Europe begin. In this gorge, buried in a stone-framed grave facing the river, there was a man. He died around 6200 BCE. That's 8,000 years ago. His bones survived, and in 2022, scientists extracted something from those bones that nobody was ready for. His Y-chromosome, the genetic material passed from father to son, generation after generation, is genetically closer to men living in Sarajevo today than it is to any living person in London, Paris, or Berlin. Let that sit for a second. 8,000 years, dozens of empires, invasion after invasion, migration after migration, and the DNA from that grave still matches the men in the valley next door. The site is called Lepenski Vir, and it wasn't a campsite. These people built permanent stone houses, trapezoidal, carved directly into the riverbank. They stayed. They buried their dead facing the river. They carved sculptures from the boulders, half human, half fish, and placed them at the center of each home. Not weapons, not tools, faces. And here is the thing that the standard history of Europe will never tell you. During the last ice age, roughly 24,000 to 19,000 years ago, most of Europe was not livable. The ice pushed south all the way to the Alps. The land north of the Pyrenees was open tundra, wind-blasted and lethal. But the Balkans, sheltered on 3 sides by mountains, warmed on the 4th by the Adriatic, became a refuge. The last place on the continent where some number of humans held on. And when the ice retreated, they went north. The genetic flow that repopulated Europe didn't come from somewhere else. It came out of the Balkans. Europe wasn't the destination. The Balkans were the source. Dr. Ian Matheson at the University of Pennsylvania spent years building one of the most comprehensive ancient DNA datasets ever assembled from southeastern Europe. In 2018, his team published in Nature, and what they found was that the hunter-gatherer ancestry of southeastern Europe persisted through the Neolithic transition at higher rates than anywhere else on the continent. It didn't disappear. It held. This isn't in your DNA right now as a faint trace from some distant ancestral footnote. If you have European ancestry, any at all, this is in your biological foundation. This is where you started. And here's what the genomic modeling tells us about that survival. The breeding population in the Balkan refugium during the glacial peak may have been in the low hundreds. One bad winter, one disease event, one failed harvest. That Y chromosome doesn't exist. You don't exist. Nobody watching this video exists. The entire subsequent history of Europe rests on the survival of a few hundred people in a river gorge that most people today couldn't find on a map. If you've ever wondered where you actually come from, not the country, not the ethnicity, but the biological starting point, subscribe. Because this goes further back than anything you've been told before. Real quick, before we go any further, if you've ever taken a DNA ancestry test, did the results show Balkan, Eastern European, or ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry you didn't expect? Drop it in the comments. Because what comes next might explain something your results never could. And if you haven't tested, tell me anyway, does your family carry a story about where they originally came from? A place always mentioned, a tradition nobody can explain? Leave it below. I read every single one. They survived, but they didn't survive nameless. In 5700 BCE, about 3,000 years after the man at Lepenski Vir was buried, a community built something new on a bend of the Danube, about 14 kilometers from what would one day become Belgrade. They stayed. They built up, layer after layer, generation after generation, for 2,500 years. The archaeologist Miloje Vasic excavated this site between 1908 and 1934 and found 10.5 meters of continuous occupation. One place, one community, building upward through time. This was the Vinca culture. And they left something behind that the academic mainstream has been quietly arguing about for 50 years. More than 1,000 artifacts, across over 700 sites, all bearing the same symbols. Repeated, consistent, associated with ritual objects. Abstract marks that appear again and again in specific combinations. Maria Gimbutas, trained at Harvard, later at UCLA, and linguist Harold Harman at the Institute of Archaeomythology in Austria both identified these as a proto-writing system, predating Sumerian cuneiform by at least 2,000 years. The mainstream classification? decorative markings. But here's the thing. A peer-reviewed analysis of the symbol structure found non-random frequency distributions across the entire dataset. Random scratches don't do that. Writing does. Nobody deciphered them. Nobody agreed on what to call them. And the archive of the man who spent his life excavating the site, Miloje Vasic, sat untranslated in Serbian for decades. Not lost, just not prioritized. And while the world was busy ignoring Vinča, the coast of Bulgaria had its own secret. In 1972, near the town of Varna, construction workers digging a canal accidentally opened a necropolis. When archaeologists arrived and began cataloging the graves, they realized what they were looking at. The oldest large gold find in human history. In a single grave, grave 43, lay the remains of a man approximately 50 years old, buried with 990 individual gold objects. Bracelets, a chest piece, a gold penis sheath, a copper axe, a ceramic vessel with traces of a fermented grain beverage. The total gold weight in that single burial was greater than all known contemporary burials in Mesopotamia and Egypt combined. This man lived in 4560 BCE, before the pyramids, before the Sumerians had organized themselves into city-states, before almost everything the world considers ancient civilization. Ian Matheson's team eventually sequenced the DNA of the Varna individuals, and what they found was the same genetic profile as the broader Balkan Neolithic population, the merger of Anatolian farmers and local hunter-gatherers. The man who owned the world's first gold was built from both lines, the newcomers and the people who were already there, the merger, producing something new. But there was one individual at the site who carried a paternal lineage associated with the older hunter-gatherer stratum, a ghost in the foundation of the gold civilization. That ghost never left. That ghost has a name, or rather, it doesn't. And that's the problem. The Illyrians, the Thracians, the Dacians, these are the names the ancient Balkans have in our history books. But those names weren't chosen by the people who lived there. They were assigned by Romans and Greeks who encountered them as enemies, as conquered subjects, as people to be taxed. They named them the way you label a container, for your own convenience, not theirs. And when you look at the genomics, those names don't correspond to distinct biological populations. They correspond to regional administrative categories applied to a continuous genetic substrate that had been living in the same valleys for 10,000 years before anyone arrived with a pen to categorize it. A 2023 preprint from a multi-institutional team, including researchers from the University of Oxford, analyzed over 6,000 ancient West Eurasian genomes alongside 74 newly sequenced ethnic Albanians. What they found in the Albanian genetic record was something you almost never see in European genomics: genuine continuity. Ancient Western Balkan ancestry, traceable to the late Bronze Age, showing only 10 to 20% Slavic admixture across the medieval period. That's the lowest Slavic admixture fraction in the entire Balkan region. And stay with me, because this is the reason this specific finding matters. The Slavic migration of the 6th and 7th centuries CE reshaped the genetic identity of most of Eastern Europe. In many regions, it replaced the majority of the pre-existing population signal. But in the Western Balkans, particularly in Albania and parts of Bosnia, the old substrate held. Not because the migrations didn't reach there, they did. But something about the combination of geography and population density meant the old signal survived beneath the new one. Now, here's where the story gets strange at a much larger scale. The Yamna expansion, around 3000 BCE, herders from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, what is now Ukraine and southern Russia, began moving west and south in numbers that changed the genetic face of an entire continent. In Britain, they replaced up to 90% of the pre-existing ancestry in just a few centuries. In Central Europe, similar rates. In Scandinavia, similar rates. In the Western Balkans, partial replacement. The old floor survived, and the people who carried that floor through it all, through the Bronze Age steppe expansion, through Rome, through the Slavic migrations, through the Ottoman period, left no empire, no self-written texts, no political state that historians agreed to take seriously. They left a chromosome, and that chromosome is in the blood of millions of people alive right now, arguing about their ethnic identities on the internet. That chromosome has an address: Varna, Bulgaria. The necropolis, dated 4569 to 4340 BCE. The gold. The man in grave 43. We established who he was, but the genetics of Varna opened a different problem, one that researchers working with ancient European DNA had been circling for years without solving. The models were wrong. For 3 decades, ancient DNA studies of Europe were dominated by samples from Western and Northern European sites, British Bronze Age burials, German Neolithic sites, Scandinavian Viking-era graves. The Balkans were underrepresented, not because nobody thought they mattered, but because the infrastructure for systematic archaeological sampling in southeastern Europe lagged behind Western institutions. The models that got built were built without the most important room in the building. When Ian Mathiassen's team published in Nature in 2018, they introduced genome-wide data from 225 ancient humans dating back 12,000 years, including Balkan Mesolithic samples that had never been analyzed at this resolution before. What they found in the Balkan data didn't fit the existing European models. The hunter-gatherer ancestry fraction in southeastern Europe was higher than the models predicted. The Balkan populations weren't blending the way the rest of Europe was blending. The substrate was deeper, the persistence was longer, the data wasn't wrong, the framework was. And then Inigo Olalde changed everything again. Olalde is a research fellow at the University of the Basque Country in Spain, working in collaboration with Harvard's Reich Lab. In 2023, his team published in Cell, and it was the largest ancient DNA study of the Balkans ever conducted. 146 ancient genomes spanning the first millennium CE, Roman period, late antique period, early medieval, Slavic migration wave. Here's what they found during the Roman period, and this nobody expected. The influx of new genetic ancestry into the Balkans during Roman rule didn't come primarily from Italy. It came from Anatolia. The Romans reshaped the genetics of the Balkans not through Roman soldiers setting down roots, but through the populations they moved into the region: slaves, merchants, soldiers recruited from the eastern provinces. Hold on to that, because it means something different. Everything I just told you, the ancient substrate, the Neolithic merger, the Bronze Age survival, is about to mean something completely different. One individual in the Olalde study was buried in a Roman-era Balkan site with standard Roman grave goods. His childhood diet, reconstructed from strontium isotopes in his dental enamel, was completely different from the local population. His genetic profile matched a population from the region of sub-Saharan Africa most closely, a child born somewhere near the Upper Nile, buried in the Roman Balkans in the 3rd century CE, in the same ground as the descendants of people who had been in that valley for 10,000 years. The Roman Balkans were not an ethnic backwater. They were a crossroads of the known world, and even inside that cosmopolitan chaos, the old floor was still there. Actually, if you watched our last video on Albanian DNA, you already saw the edge of this. A people holding their genetic ground against everything. What did you think? Did that change how you see the difference between ethnicity and actual ancestral DNA? Tell me in the comments. And then stay with me, because what's coming next is the exact piece that video was building toward. Let's stop, because before we go any further, we need to do something most DNA videos never do. We need to make the strongest possible case against everything we've told you so far. Because if the Balkans' source argument is right, it has to survive a real challenge. And the challenge is serious. Iberia. The Iberian Peninsula also survived the Ice Age. The same logic applies. The mountains of northern Spain and southwestern France provided shelter during the Last Glacial Maximum. The Basques, who live in that precise region today, carry some of the highest hunter-gatherer ancestry levels in Europe. Their language, Basque, is a pre-Indo-European isolate, meaning it doesn't descend from any known language family. That's linguistic evidence of a population so old and so continuous that the Indo-European expansion, which reshaped the languages of the entire continent, couldn't fully reach them. Pontus Skoglund at the Francis Crick Institute in the UK has spent years documenting the post-Ice Age genetic expansion from the Iberian refugium, north along the Atlantic coast, into France, Britain, and eventually Scandinavia. This is real. It's published. It's not fringe. There are 2 findings that resolve this debate. The third one is the one nobody talks about. Wolfgang Hack at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig led a team in 2015 that analyzed 69 ancient Europeans spanning 5,000 years. At the time, it was the largest ancient DNA study ever published. It confirmed the steppe migration we talked about, but buried in the same paper was a finding about the two refugia, Iberia and the Balkans, that received almost no coverage outside the field. The Iberian post-Ice Age expansion moves north and northwest, Atlantic coast, France, Britain, Ireland. The Balkan post-Ice Age expansion moves north, northeast, and east into Central Europe, the Carpathian Basin, the Baltic, the Ukrainian steppe frontier. The territory covered by the Balkan expansion was larger. The population modeling in the same study suggested the Balkan refugium harbored more survivors, more descendants, more reach. The Iberian signal is visible in modern Europeans because Western Europe was disturbed less by subsequent migrations. The Balkan signal is deep because it was the floor that everything else was built on top of. That study was published in 2015. Nobody made a YouTube video about it until now, and here's where the conventional story of the Neolithic gets turned upside down. The standard account says Anatolian farmers moved into Europe around 7000 BCE and replaced the hunter-gatherers. In most of Western Europe, that's roughly true. But in the Balkans, the farmers arrived and met the descendants of Lepenski Vir, and they didn't replace them. They merged. The farmer-hunter binary that defines European prehistory everywhere else simply breaks down in the Balkans. What came out of that merger was something Europe had never seen before, and it built the world's first gold burial, and it carved symbols on pottery that no one has ever fully decoded, and it is, in a measurable fraction, in your genome right now. That merger had a product, a specific genetic profile, and that profile went everywhere. The early European farmer, EEF in the shorthand, is the name for the ancestry that emerged when Anatolian Neolithic migrants fused with Western Balkan hunter-gatherers. In the Balkans, this profile kept a higher fraction of the old hunter-gatherer signal than in any other EEF population on the continent. The Balkans were not just where the merger happened, they were where it went deepest. And then, around 4300 BCE, the civilizations built from that merger, Vinca, Varna, Cucuteni Tripelia, began to collapse, not to invasion, to climate. A 200-year drought event, identifiable in pollen records extracted from lake sediment cores in Serbia and Romania, reduced the population density across the entire region. The people dispersed, and when they dispersed, they took that genome with them. Wolfgang Hoch's 2015 Nature study confirmed it. The EEF ancestry, with its specific Balkan hunter-gatherer fraction, appears as a foundational layer across all of continental Europe, from Iberia to the Baltic. It's beneath the steppe layer, beneath the Roman demographic reshuffling, beneath the Slavic migration. The Balkan-sourced EEF is in the substrate of virtually every European genome on Earth. This isn't a regional ancestry story. If you have European ancestry anywhere in your family, this is your story. The Balkans are not someone else's origin. They are yours. Now, a researcher at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, working on Chalcolithic Balkan genomes, found something that stopped her research cold for a moment. The EEF signal from the Balkans appeared in her own DNA. She's Turkish, and what her genome showed was a genetic echo of a population expansion that moved south and east back into Anatolia, reversing the original direction of the Neolithic migration. The people who left Anatolia for the Balkans 7,000 years earlier had, in the generations that followed, sent a genetic signal back. The Olalde study added another layer. Modern Serbs retain approximately 50% of the pre-Slavic, pre-Roman Balkan substrate in their genome. Half, not a trace. The majority fraction of a modern person's ancestry in a country that has been invaded, occupied, and reshaped by empires for 3,000 years traces back through an unbroken biological thread to before Rome ever existed. But here's where it gets strange, because that other 50% came from people who arrived as conquerors. And when you sequence those conquerors, the Yamna, the Bronze Age steppe herders who remapped the genetics of Europe, you find something nobody anticipated. The Yamna carried a fraction of ancestry from Caucasus and Eastern Anatolian populations that had themselves received EEF admixture from earlier contact with Balkan-descended farmers. The conquerors were, in a measurable fraction, built from the people they were coming to overwrite. They carried the Balkans inside them, and neither population knew it. Overwrote, but not completely, not everywhere, and nowhere less completely than here. The Western Balkans, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Western Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, show the highest retention of pre-steppe, pre-Slavic ancestry in the entire European continent. The Dinaric Alps created a natural barrier. The mountains protected the valleys. The valleys held the genome. The ancient substrate survived. The story resolves. In fact, the Olalde team's 2023 cell paper confirmed it directly. Even through Roman rule, even through a full century of frontier militarization, even through the demographic reshuffling Rome imposed, the pre-existing Balkan genetic structure was retained. The substrate beneath the substrate. Olalde's own words from the paper, despite extensive militarization and cultural influence, we find the pre-existing Balkan genetic structure retained. So here is where we are. The Balkans survived the Ice Age. The Balkans developed independent complex civilization, copper metallurgy, proto-writing, the world's first gold. The Balkans served as the genetic source for the population expansion that repopulated post-Ice Age Europe. The Balkans resisted genetic replacement at a higher rate than any other European region. And the ancient substrate is measurably present in the majority genome of people living there today. The story is complete. The evidence is verified. The case is closed. But what they found next changed everything we thought we knew about what original even means. Matheson's 2018 Nature study, the same study that confirmed the persistence of Balkan hunter-gatherer ancestry, also confirmed where the Neolithic component of that Balkan genome came from. The early European farmers, the people who merged with the Lepenski Vir descendants and built Vinča and Varna, were not indigenous to the Balkans in any absolute sense. Their genome traces to populations in the Fertile Crescent of the ancient Near East who migrated into Anatolia and from Anatolia into the Balkans around 7000 BCE. Every original people has a prior people. Every floor has a floor below it. What makes the Balkans remarkable is not that they were first in any absolute sense. It's that they were the place where the deepest surviving European genetic signal was forged, from a merger of arrivals and indigenes held through every subsequent catastrophe and passed forward across 10,000 years. The question of who is from anywhere has no clean answer. The Balkans just go deeper than anywhere else in Europe. And that depth is about to become the most politically uncomfortable fact in this entire story. In the summer of 1995, in the hills outside a town called Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia, approximately 8,000 Muslim Bosniak men and boys were systematically murdered over 11 days. The killings were carried out by Bosnian Serb forces. The tribunal at The Hague later classified it as genocide, the worst act of mass killing in Europe since the Second World War. The justification, as stated by the perpetrators and their political leadership at the time, was ethnic. Serbs and Bosniaks were different peoples, different origins, different blood. Here is what the genomic record says. Modern Serbs and modern Bosnian Croats share a genetic substrate that is, at the population level, statistically continuous. Both populations carry nearly identical proportions of three ancestry components: ancient Balkan hunter-gatherer ancestry from the pre-Neolithic substrate, Neolithic Anatolian farmer ancestry from the EEF layer, and Bronze Age steppe ancestry from the Yamna expansion. The fractions differ by margins that fall within the normal variation you'd expect between neighboring villages, not between distinct peoples. The Olalde 2023 cell study confirmed this. The pre-Slavic Balkan genetic substrate, the one that survived ice ages, that built Vinča, that buried its dead with gold, is present in both populations. The Slavic-related ancestry that arrived in the 6th and 7th centuries is present in both populations. The Roman-era Anatolian admixture is present in both populations. The science does not record two peoples. It records one ancient population in one geographic region that was assigned different ethnic labels by different political movements in different centuries, and then told the labels were biological truth. They were not biological truth. Now let me be clear about what I am not saying. I am not saying religion is genetics. I am not saying cultural identity is reducible to a genome. I am not saying the suffering of any community is diminished by what a sequencer reads from a bone fragment. Those are human realities and they deserve their full weight. What I am saying is this: the genetic difference used to justify the murder of 8,000 people in Srebrenica in 1995 does not appear in the DNA record. The ancient substrate that both populations carry, the one from Lepenski Vir, the one from Varna, the one that survived the Ice Age in a river gorge, does not distinguish between them. The chromosome doesn't know what flag was planted above the valley it was born in. And before we reach the last thing I need to tell you, there is one more question you should sit with. Because if any European ancestry runs through your family line, and if the Balkan EEF substrate is in the foundation of virtually all European genomes, then you carry a fraction of that same ancient signal too, not as heritage, as biology. The people buried at Lepenski Vir, the man with the gold at Varna, the woman who carved symbols into Vinca pottery that no one has decoded, they are in you in a way that is not metaphorical and not symbolic. It is chemical. It is structural. It is there whether you know it or not. There is still something missing from the record. Not from this video, from the science itself, from the field. The ancient Balkan substrate, the WHG hunter-gatherer signal, the I2 paternal lineage, the ghost at the foundation of the gold civilization, is confirmed in the modern population. It is measurable. It is documented in peer-reviewed papers from Harvard, from Leipzig, from the University of the Basque Country. But the individuals who carried it through the gap between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, through the Bronze Age steppe collision, through Rome, through the Slavic overlay, most of them have never been sequenced. The ancient DNA database from the Western Balkans between approximately 2000 BCE and 500 CE has enormous gaps. The sites exist, the burials are there. The funding and the access have not always followed. The full story of how the oldest genetic signal in Europe survived is not yet written. The researchers who will write it are working right now, in laboratories in Germany and Spain and Croatia and Serbia, on samples that haven't been published yet. The answer may arrive after you finish watching this. The question is still open. Here is what we know. There was a river gorge. There was a group of people. The ice came and they stayed. When the ice left, they spread, and the continent that eventually became home to billions of people carried their genome forward. They built, they carved, they buried their dead facing the water. They created the world's first gold. They merged with newcomers and produced something that went everywhere. They survived replacements that erased populations twice their size elsewhere on the continent. They carried no empire. They left no state. They left no name that anyone agreed to use. And across 10,000 years of invasion and overlay and renaming and killing, including killing each other over identities their own biology refused to confirm, the chromosome held. The man in the stone-framed grave at Lepenski Vir, who died in 6200 BCE facing the river, has living descendants. They are in the Balkans today. They are in the populations that spread across Europe. They are, in some fraction, in you. He did not know he was the beginning of anything. He was just a person in a valley where the conditions for survival happened to exist. And he survived. That is the only story that was ever being told.